Thank you for joining us today. We're going to give it a few minutes, let people roll into the room, and then we'll get started. Again, good morning, good afternoon. Just waiting a few minutes to let attendees get into the room, and then we will begin for the day. All right. Thank you again for joining us today. I'm just going to wait one more minute and we will get started. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carrie Kernan, and I am the Sales Development Manager here at TPGI. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today for navigating the European Accessibility Act, Your Road to Compliance. Just going to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. This session is being recorded, and we will email everyone the recording after the event. We have captions available, so feel free to use them as needed. We will have time for live Q&A. Please use the Q&A box, and we will answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. Lastly, I'd also like to mention if anyone needs any accessibility support, training, or usability testing, you can reach out to IDA, and that's IDA at tpgi.com. And I'll send that email into the chat as well. And with that, I will let our presenters, Mark Miller and David Sloan, introduce themselves and get started.
Thank you, Carrie. And thanks everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to present on this topic. I think it's a hot one and it has a lot of interest because there's a lot of upcoming timing on it that I'm sure you're all thinking about and concerned about. So first of all, I am Mark Miller. I'm the Director of Sales here at TPGI, and I'm joined today by David Sloan, who is our Chief Accessibility Officer and our US UX Practice Manager. So together we'll be going through everything with you today. Our agenda starts with introducing the European Accessibility Act, then moves to what products and services are covered, EAA requirements summarized, EAA's relation to technical accessibility and standards, the implications for business, and then finally, your EAA trail map, a strategy for meeting and maintaining conformance, and then we'll go over any takeaways as well. So with that, I would like to introduce David Sloan.
Thank you, Mark. And hi, everybody. Glad you could join us for this session. So I'm going to start by giving some background into the European Accessibility Act. Some of you may detect from my accent that I am European. I'm from Scotland, but I'm currently living in the US. So this is European accessibility, something close to my heart, even if I'm a little physically further away than I used to be. So the European Accessibility Act is the latest in a series of developments in the European Union to try to provide more guidance to organizations in providing accessible digital products and services to people with disabilities. And the European Accessibility Act is really an attempt to harmonize accessibility requirements across the EU. Previously, we had divergent rule sets, different recommendations and requirements in different countries, and a lack of shared clarity, which makes it harder for organizations to understand what they need to do to meet accessibility laws and regulations. And for those of you who advocate for accessibility, when you encounter resistance in an organization, what do we have to do? Do we really have to do this? When there isn't clarity over what you need to do, then that can make it harder to make the case internally for investment in accessibility, especially for organizations that trade across national and international boundaries. So harmonization is really all about trying to create a common set of requirements across EU member states, making it easier for product and service providers to understand what they need to do to meet accessibility requirements across Europe. And it also makes it easier for customers to know what to expect, the shared understanding of accessibility requirements. This is all motivated by ongoing attempts to build on the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and to fundamentally preserve the civil rights for people with disabilities not to encounter discrimination when accessing digital products and services. But there is also a business logic. And people with disabilities have spending power, and the population of disabled people in Europe is growing. 101 million, or 1 in 4 people aged over 16 in the European Union as of 2022 have a disability. So it's a significant population that is potentially excluded from products and services provided through digital means. So all of this is an effort to try and help reduce market fragmentation and provide consistency in accessibility requirements and make the digital landscape more accessible to people with disabilities. So what about timing? Well, the EAA had a deadline of June 22 for it to be transposed into member state law. And that deadline kind of was missed by a lot of member states, but there is significant progress being made. But fundamentally, this means that the European Accessibility Act is a directive of the European Union that then each member state has to adopt into its own national legislation and regulation. But the interesting bit from our perspective is that covered products and services provided to the EU market must meet EAA requirements by June 28th, 2025. And that is, if we have our sums right, that's 15 months and 28 days from now, 69 weeks and 2 days from now, 485 days from now, or just over five quarters. Either way, it's not a lot of time, but there is enough time to take action if you haven't already been thinking of doing that. And I mentioned in this slide covered products and services. There are some exceptions to the Act for certain legacy technology and also for micro enterprises. There is also an undue burden clause related to excess effort required to meet the requirements. But in each case, conformance is still recommended. And our focus on this webinar, given that we are not lawyers, we are not providing legal advice, we are accessibility advocates and technologists, our focus is on helping you understand what you need to do to meet the law. If you think that you don't, your product and service doesn't apply, then that's really a question for a legal professional. So let's move on to talk a little bit about what is covered by the EAA. And really, there's a broad range of products and services, all of which are kind of defined as things that people with disabilities have historically encountered difficulties in accessing and using. And these are things that are core to everyday life, actions, whether it's managing finances or moving from one place to another or receiving entertainment, things that are really core where digital technology has begun to play a significant part. So things like digital TV equipment, computers and operating systems, smartphones, self-service devices, kiosks, ATMs, ticketing machines, ebooks and e-readers, so hardware devices that enable access to digital services, all of this under this umbrella of information and communication technology. Then we have e-commerce websites and mobile apps, any website or mobile app that allows you to engage in a transaction with a provider, communications technology and equipment, banking services, passenger transport services, air, land, waterborne transport, audiovisual media services, a wide range of products and services that are covered under the EAA. And moving on to the next slide, let's look at the kind of summary of the EAA requirements. And I'm presenting this in kind of two perspectives. Firstly, for product manufacturers and service providers, if you're putting a product on the market in the European Union or providing a service to citizens of European Union states, you must meet accessibility requirements for covered products and services. And these are expressed as functional requirements associated with disability profiles. For example, that there must be a means of use without vision for the product or service. I'll talk a little bit more shortly about how we can use standards, technical standards, and what the relationship is to the EAA. But fundamentally, it's about meeting functional requirements across different disability and accessibility profiles. And then also there's an obligation to provide documentation of accessibility features to describe the accessibility of the product or service, and to do so in an accessible way. So from the member state obligation or perspective, EU member states must meet requirements for monitoring compliance with the requirements of the EAA. And firstly, as I said before, that means transposing the European Accessibility Act into national legislation and regulations, then to assign an organization responsible for monitoring. So at the state level, there's a monitoring organization to check products and services to ensure that they conform to the requirements, and to implement a mechanism for dealing with non-compliance. So thinking about the potential consequences of products and services on the market that do not meet the EAA requirements. So let's now think a little bit about European standards and EAA. What's the more sort of fine-grained technical requirements that we can lean on and to help us meet the EAA? Well, this is where it gets a little bit unclear, because the EAA, while it mentions the WCAG principles of perceivable, operable, and understandable, it doesn't directly mention familiar standards like the W3C Web Content Accessibility Guidelines or EN 301549 or any other standard. However, it does include in Article 15 some provisions for organizations that meet existing standards that have been referenced in the official journal of the European Union, and EN 301549 is one of those standards. So by demonstrating evidence of EN 301549 conformance, and by extension, conformance with WCAG 2.1 AA, and I'll talk more about that connection shortly, that should help you demonstrate conformance with the European Accessibility Act. So let's now look a little bit more in detail about the relationship of those standards I just mentioned to the EAA. So EN 301549, its full title, Accessibility Requirements for ICT Products and Services, is a harmonized European standard that provides accessibility requirements for information and communication technology, ICTs, including websites, software, hardware, and digital documents. And this was initially developed to support procurement efforts of public organizations in the EU following the European Web Accessibility Directive a few years ago. So it's a standard that was produced for a previous European Accessibility Directive and still exists as a valuable resource to guide organizations in developing and providing accessible products and services. It's free, unlike a lot of standards. It doesn't cost to access and is available from the etsi.org website. The slides also have a link to a place where you can download the latest version of EN 31549. So that the slides will be distributed to everyone who registered for the webinar, so you can get access to that. Again, EN 301549 starts with some functional performance criteria that address specific accessibility needs. So at a basis, it defines ways in which the product or service must meet basic functional accessibility requirements so that people with different accessibility needs can use the product or service for its intended purpose. EN 301549 then integrates by reference technical accessibility requirements from WCAG 2.1. That was an update a few years ago where EN 301549 was harmonized with WCAG 2.1 for websites and relevant parts for other non-web digital products such as software and digital documents. It is very closely aligned with the US Section 508 standards in that its primary focus is to support procurement of accessible products. And if you are selling to public organizations, if you're selling to federal organizations or federally funded organizations in the US, then meeting Section 508 helps ensure that your product or service is eligible for purchase by that covered organization. The difference is that Section 508 still refers to WCAG 2.0 instead of 2.1, so EN is a little bit more up to date. Also of interest, Australia has adopted EN 301549 as part of its federal procurement policy. So while it's a European standard, it has been adopted by other parts of the world, and that may well increase in future. So let's talk a little bit about expected updates to the guidance provided by the European Accessibility Act and the relevant standards. I mean, ultimately, we can look at the technical standards as ways to help covered organizations meet their obligations. So by looking at and monitoring expected updates to those standards, we can be future-proofing ourselves in terms of meeting EAA requirements. Currently, EN 301549 and two other European accessibility standards. One is EN 17210 2021, accessibility and usability of the built environment. And the other one is EN 17161, design for all accessibility following a design for all approach. So that's more process standards. Those three standards are all currently undergoing updates and revisions to better support the requirements of the European Accessibility Act. You are likely aware that version 2.2 of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines was published by W3C in October last year. And we anticipate that the updated EN 301549 will directly incorporate WCAG 2.2 AA. So we can assume that when the revised EN 31549 standard is published, it will reference WCAG 2.2. The schedule for updating 301.549 gives a publication date for the updated version of early 2026, which means there is a gap between the June 28th deadline of 2025 that the EAA provides and the updated version of EN 301.549. So there's a little bit of a limbo period there, but it certainly seems prudent to look at adopting 2.2, the WCAG 2.2, on the assumption that it will be included in the updated version of EN 301.549. So what are the implications for businesses providing products and services in the European Union? Well, fundamentally, demonstrating conformance with EAA requirements by that deadline of June 28th, 2025, really is about focusing on adopting EN 31549 and, at a minimum, WCAG 2.1 level AA, or recommended WCAG 2.2 level AA. So adopting those standards to guide the process of building and providing digital products and services is one way to meet the EAA requirements. Another way that we highly recommend is to involve people with disabilities in the product and service development process and evaluation. This helps ensure that you meet those functional performance criteria, those functional requirements, to ensure that the product or service is usable for its intended purpose by people with a range of disabilities, while the standards can guide you a long way towards that goal, ultimately evaluating at a minimum and ideally involving people with disabilities throughout the design and development process will help ensure that you have focused your accessibility efforts in making the functionality usable regardless of disability. And then the third aspect, the third implication to pay attention to, is to document accessibility features of products and services. We'll talk a little bit more about ways to do that shortly, but making sure that you document the accessibility of your product or service, and you do so in an accessible way, is another important implication to address. And then secondly, to define and implement a strategy that ensures your organization has capacity to meet and maintain conformance with EAA requirements, including any new requirements that may emerge. One aspect of the EAA is that each European member state may choose to implement the EAA in slightly different ways. So having a monitoring process that allows you to make sure that you're on top of any specific requirements above and beyond the baseline requirements that I've talked about, that will help make sure that for each state that you operate in or provide products and services in, that you're meeting any specific requirements of that state. So what about the implications of non-conformance? Well, these will vary by country, depending on how the EAA is transposed into national legislation and how conformance is monitored by a particular member state. But sanctions for non-conformance could include an obligation to address the accessibility issues present in a product or service within a given time period. And if those are not met, then sanction could be a forced withdrawal of a product or service from a market. There could be fines for not meeting requirements. And this comes from recent legislation introduced in the Republic of Ireland. It even mentions the potential of imprisonment of company leadership. I mean, again, we're not lawyers, and we're not going to talk more about ways to avoid these extreme situations that could happen. But this just gives you a sense of the potential consequences of non-conformance. And it's a helpful reminder that EAA requirements are monitored at the member state level, and member states have responsibilities to address instances of non-conformance. And this is a contrast with civil rights legislation protecting the disabled people, such as the ADA in the US, which typically require people to file allegations of unlawful discrimination. Here, there are monitoring organizations that are charged with the responsibility to test products and services to make sure that they meet requirements, rather than requiring those people who are affected by accessibility to make complaints and request that fixes are made. I'm going to talk a little bit, just a moment, as a very hot topic as we enter 2024, is overlays as an accessibility technology that claims to address accessibility barriers present in a website. And there has been some discussion on the relationship of overlays and EAA conformance. Just in a nutshell, accessibility overlays are technologies that temporarily create real-time transformations to a website's appearance and functionality when a disabled person visits the site and enables the overlay. And these are intended to address underlying accessibility barriers present in the code of the website. So without fixing the code, the overlay temporarily transforms the website, in theory, to overcome barriers present in the code. However, overlays cannot currently automatically detect or fix all possible accessibility issues present in a site. And there have been instances, evidence of overlay solutions that have been found to make websites less accessible to people using assistive technology. And for that reason, the European Commission Director General of Communication issued a statement on overlays and concluded that the Director General of Communication cannot endorse any tools or products that fall into the categories of overlay tools or widgets. So while overlays might be attractive to an organization seeking a quick fix with limited time and resources, they do bring significant risks if relied upon instead of investing in an accessibility strategy and a commitment to meeting the EAA requirements. So there's the background. I'm going to now hand over to Mark to take you through the EAA trail map and help you, give you examples of what you can do to meet the EAA requirements.
Thank you, David. And I'm going to try to move through this pretty quickly because we already have a ton of really good questions piling up. So I'm going to make sure that we leave ample time at the end for those. And thanks everyone for being here and for asking such great questions. I've been looking through them. So you're going to have some work to do, David, when I'm done with this. So what I want to talk to you about today is what we call our EAA trail map. It's really our recommended plan for addressing the requirements of the EAA in meeting that guideline that we're looking at happening at the end of June next year. So the steps to our guide are to first assess, right? Then from that assessment to create a strategy. Part of that strategy will dictate preparing to meet the guidelines and identifying the support that you need. Once that's all occurred, you can go into this step 4 of implementation. And as probably most of you realize, when it comes to accessibility, there sort of isn't an end, right? There's no, you don't cross the finish line and you're there and you don't have to worry about it anymore. There may be sort of an initial effort to get yourself, brought up to speed, so to speak. But it's really about maintaining it. So step 5 is, how do you go from there and maintain that accessibility over time? So let's talk about assessing. The first thing to think about when you assess is establishing a technical conformance goal, which we've really talked about quite a bit. EN 301549 is probably the first place that you really want to reference to understanding that. we know that draws a line directly to the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, specifically at the 2.1 level. And as David was talking about, we would really recommend looking at it at the 2.2 level, which came out in October, largely because it seems like right after that June 2025 deadline, we're going to see an update to EN 301549 that'll point to WCAG 2.2. So obviously it makes a lot more sense to start there. Also, 2.2 has additional things in it that are good to consider just from the overall usability of the site and making sure people can participate in what it is that you're offering, as well as addressing a particular guideline that was no longer relevant. So you're better off starting there at this point. Inventorying your current digital products or services, and this would include things like websites, mobile applications, kiosks. Kiosks really fall under any enclosed system that you're putting out there. So think of your payment systems, even when you walk into a store and maybe you want to apply for a job there and they sit you down in front of a computer, that would all fall under this sort of kiosk category where you have a dedicated hardware, software enclosed system that's typically being offered out there in the public. But understanding what you have for assets and being able to make sure that you address everything, right? It's sort of one of those things where you don't want to assume it's just about your websites or your mobile apps, and then realize that you've got some gaps in what you're putting out there that could continue to put you at risk. And then assessing each one of those against your conformance goal. So understanding where it stands related to the guidelines or to EN 31549. And this can be done in a lot of ways. There's automated scanning out there. Many of you may understand that automated scanning is not a complete solution. It's a really good part of an overall strategy, and it has a ton of value in maintaining and reaching conformance to guidelines overall, but it cannot tell you every single variant you have to the guidelines. So that's why manual testing is really important, because having people actually evaluate a representative sample on your site and interact with it as using assistive technologies and in the way that people with disabilities do, that's going to best inform your conformance to those guidelines or what level you're at. And then, of course, you want to turn your attention to your team as well and really understand what's their awareness level. Are they aware of accessibility? Do they understand accessibility? Do you have people on your team that actually have knowledge and skills around accessibility? And if not, or if so, where are those gaps? What is it that you're going to have to do to close those gaps so that everybody is aware, does understand, and particularly for their role, has the knowledge they need to successfully maintain accessibility on your assets? And then a really important key to this is senior leadership and other stakeholders in the organization that can ensure that accessibility is part of an ongoing strategy and baked into everything that the organization is doing. So the next thing we'll talk about is step 2, which is to create a strategy or strategize. And this is really where you're communicating your desire for a future state of accessibility and creating a plan to reach that state. So where do we want to get to? And at this point, you should understand that based on the guidelines and your inventorying, and based on understanding your skill sets internally. So where is it that you want to reach? What is it that you want to get to? And a lot of that may be obvious, sort of what we would call substantial with the conformance with the guidelines is an obvious one, but also you're thinking about what condition do I want my team to be in? What condition do I want my policies and procedures to be in? Where do we want to be as an organization to support accessibility ongoing and into the future? And then defining accessibility responsibilities for stakeholders involved in creating and managing digital resources. So it's great to say that we're going to do all this, but then getting down to the individuals that are going to have an impact on that success and saying, in really helping everyone understand what their responsibility is so that it's clear, right? So that there's no, I thought you were going to take care of that sort of things that go on, and that management is including it and pushing and prioritizing it. And then you want to plan for accessibility, addressing any barriers that you've found through assessments, and a good assessment is going to help you prioritize those things. So it may take you a while to do that. It's one of the reasons why we recommend you start thinking about this now and actioning on it now, because while June of 2025 seems a bit in the future in terms of doing this effort, it's really not. So understanding those barriers, prioritizing those barriers, and getting yourself to a state of people with accessibility being able to use those products as quickly as possible is important. And then managing that accessibility in any new resources that you build. So there's two pieces of it, right? The things that you already have out there, and then the things that you're going to create in the future. So having a policy around both of those, right? But particularly around how are we going to, going forward, build things that have accessibility included in them. One, so that you're doing it when it's easy, right? It's really much easier to include accessibility while you're creating something, while you're building something, shifting left into the SDLC rather than waiting until that product is out in production and then going, oh, geez, man, we forgot about this. Let's go address it. And you're going to be in that situation no matter what to a degree, but going forward, you can change that. And then, as David mentioned earlier, involving people with disabilities in product development and evaluation is hugely helpful in making sure that you have products that are usable by people with disabilities. And then, as we saw as a requirement of the EAA, creating accessibility documentation for those resources. So helping people understand how those resources accommodate people with disabilities so that they can, check themselves to understand if there's something that they need to be doing to experience that accessibility. So step 3 is prepare and support. So, we talked a lot about looking at the different roles in the organization. So providing training to those roles and providing training that are specific to those roles is really important. So the general accessibility training may be very good overall, but then you're going to have to dig into what is your job and what do you need. If you're a developer, obviously some of the technical aspects of developing towards accessibility. If you're QA, how you check for accessibility. If you are management, what's important to you. How do you include accessibility? If you're design, how do you make sure you're providing design comps that your developers can then pick up and make accessible and understand how to make accessible out of that? So defining accessibility tests to be performed on digital resources. So we've talked a bit about that. There's manual tests, there's automation. So defining what those are going to be, how you're going to approach that, and how you're going to continue to approach that into the future. Provide tools to support building and monitoring accessible digital resources. So that gets back to your resources, like what tooling, what knowledge, and what tooling do people need to successfully include accessibility in what they're building, but also in monitoring and making sure that if risk is introduced to something, because we know nothing's perfect, that you have a way of that being alerted early on so that you can react to it early on. And then creating a shared repository of accessibility knowledge to support team members. Knowledge bases are very important. We have an incredibly robust knowledge base that our clients access through us, but also customizing that knowledge base specific to the way that you're developing the types of products that you're developing or creating is also important. So that brings us to step 4. How do we implement all of that, right? So the first step is to work through the processes of remediating barriers present in your existing resources. So what is it going to take? Like I said before, there's no light switch here, right? You can't just flip a switch and have things be accessible overnight. So working through that process of actually taking those defined barriers and improving them, meeting accessibility requirements as early as possible within that development life cycle. Particularly when you're developing new resources or improving or adding to existing resources is hugely important because it's less expensive. It doesn't enter risk into production for any time at all, anything that you catch ahead of time. And it's much more efficient, right, than missing it in the beginning and making up for it later. And then, as we talked about before, including people with disabilities in the evaluation process is hugely important because they understand innately what it is that they need in order to have a good experience, and they're going to be able to help you build that from the beginning. And then documenting that progress towards addressing accessibility requirements, including producing an accessibility statement for each of the digital assets you provide to customers. So step 5 is to monitor and grow. So once you have all this in place, it's really important to track the accessibility data for every one of these assets and address where you are in improvements. And particularly address how quickly that's happening. So if it's not happening quick enough, you can take steps to change that. Review and address gaps in knowledge and tools available. So we talked about that in the beginning, but just because you've done that initially, once you create these processes and these procedures and you take the steps to remediate anything that's pre-existing, there's going to be a lot of lessons learned. So how do you take those lessons learned and reapply them? Maybe you find that there was additional knowledge that your team needs, or additional tools that your team needs, or whatever it may be, several other things. And then review and report your success, and of course celebrate it, right? It's a lot of work, and it's a lot of work for a very, very good reason. As Dave alluded to before, the EAA is really just giving guidance and a requirement to do this, but they're requiring you to do something that's a really good idea anyways, because it allows more people to access and participate in your product. And of course, it's the right thing to do. So getting to this point really is quite an achievement and should be celebrated. So a couple of things that I just want to look at before we turn over to questions here is that one of the ways that we look at this is through this sort of simple version of an accessibility maturity model that contemplates largely a software development lifecycle here. And we really have software and services to help people at each stage of this maturity. So as you move through improving your ability to create accessible assets, you're going to need different things, just like we talked about. And those things could include manual audits and verifications, monitoring through technology, things like knowledge-based, role-based training, design reviews, even a roadmap to move you along this curve. That's one of the things that David and I both specialize in. I'm on the W3C working group for their maturity roadmap, and David has dedicated a lot of his careers into roadmap. So we help a lot of organizations create that roadmap and that plan to move forward. And then, of course, that optimized state where you're really monitoring and improving upon all of those things. So this is a really interesting slide. I think that it's a great graphic, and for anybody who can't see the slide, this is really one of the few that's come up with a graphic, and it's an x-axis and a y-axis with a curve moving up on kind of the ROI. We call it ROA, return on accessibility here. So just sort of a gentle curve moving up as improvement is made, with the beginning of the curve being level 1 and reactive level 2 defined and level 3 optimized, referring to your state of maturity around your accessibility capability. And then this here is a look at the SDLC, and it's represented in a figure 8 that really shows, and this is our tooling, but I'll talk through it more generally here. But it really shows how you can implement tooling and knowledge and all sorts of things along the entire software development lifecycle. So from the planning phase, right, making sure you plan and include accessibility in that phase, to design and code. So it's design reviews, that's moving automated scanning into your DevOps, into your CI/CD pipeline, so that when you commit that code, you're actually checking that code for accessibility. And then, of course, testing, right? So your QA staff having the tools, the knowledge, the training that they need to make sure that they test, the QA for accessibility. And then monitoring that production state of everything and using that information to inform improvements as you go back through the figure 8 a second time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave to just go through our conclusion here. And then, David, when you're done with that, I'll start reading some of these great questions that we've gotten, and we can, I think we've left plenty of time to tackle most of them.
Sounds good. Yeah, thanks, Mark. So just to conclude, the fundamental take-home message is that there is a requirement to meet EAA requirements by June 28th of 2025 for all covered digital products or services sold or provided in the European Union. So if that is you, then you need to act now to ensure that your organization has the capacity and the capability to meet and to continue to meet those requirements from that date and beyond. And our key recommendations to you as an organization are to adopt EN 31549 and ideally WCAG 2.2 level AA as technical guidance to help you meet accessibility requirements. Combine automated and manual accessibility testing to identify issues that need to be addressed. Address those issues in a prioritized way based on helping ensure that people with disabilities can use the product or service for its intended purpose. Involve disabled people throughout the product or service development and testing lifecycle to ensure that you're focusing on making it possible for people to use that product or service for its intended purpose. And that allows you to prioritize your efforts on the areas that have most positive impact. And then to document accessibility features of the product or service. And Mark, I'm going to kind of jump ahead and answer one question that Beverly Jones asked, where Beverly said documentation of the accessibility features of products and services has been referenced a number of times. Is there a standard for how to present this so there is consistency for the end user? And it's a really good question. Yes, we have mentioned this requirement a few times without necessarily saying what's a way to do that. The EAA doesn't have a specific definition of what should be included in a particular product or service accessibility statement. However, the European Public Sector Web Accessibility Directive did provide some more guidance in that area. So again, looking back on what existed before, it seems reasonable to say that this would be good advice to follow to meet that particular requirement to appropriately document accessibility features of the product or service. And I'm going to, in an answer to Beverly's question, I'm going to share a link to an article provided by Centre for Universal Design in Ireland that provides some really helpful information on preparing and providing an accessibility statement based on the model accessibility template that exists for EU member states. So it's a way to communicate accessibility information to the people who need it most, i.e. people with disabilities, people who have accessibility needs related to that. And I see Jivan Reddy Anupali asked a question about VPAT similar to Section 508 in EAA. For those of you who are familiar with the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template and use that to provide accessibility conformance reports, there is a version of the VPAT that allows you to report against EN 301549, along with WCAG 2.2, the international version of the VPAT. So that is a way to report on the accessibility of your product or service. The challenge with ACR VPAT is that it requires a level of accessibility knowledge that many users may not have. It's more concerned with reporting against conformance with technical standards. So while it's certainly valuable for organizations who may be considering purchasing or procuring your digital product for their business in Europe, for end users, it assumes a level of technical information that they may not have. So providing the accessibility statement and focusing that on giving help to disabled users of your product or service, and especially if they encounter difficulties, providing them with assistance on how to report problems and get help overcoming any barrier that's present in your product or service. that's really the primary focus of your accessibility statement. So see the accessibility statement and the ACR VPAT as complementary, both ways to communicate accessibility, but to slightly different audiences.
Great, thank you, David. So we're going to go into the rest of the questions. The first thing I'll say is if you have put your question in the chat, you might want to slip it into the bottom of the Q&A because that's what I'm going to use. And we're going to go through and try to answer we've got quite a few in the Q&A, so we're going to try to be as concise as possible when we answer them so that we can get through the rest of them in the next 10 plus minutes. Also, I just want to point out that we have created a TPGI's guide to the EAA, and we have a URL link to it and a QR code so that you can download it as well. So that's an additional resource for you that goes into detail about sort of how to start thinking about and addressing the EAA within your organization. So with that, David, I think I'll read the question, and then if I can answer it, I will, but most of these will probably be for you. So the first one comes from, and pardon me if I mess up your names along the way, but Eric Scholes, and he says, I am at an American community college that that recruits EU students. Is it safe to assume that we would be required to comply?
I think I'm going to preface, I've looked at a lot of these questions, and several of them are related to, does this specific technology, is this specific technology covered or not? And as a general state, I'm going to say once again that we are not legal professionals, and any advice that we provide on whether a particular product or service is covered or not is our interpretation. And as an accessibility advocate, fundamentally, I want you to to take steps to make everything that you work with, everything that you have influence over, as accessible as possible. And while the EAA has specific requirements, they connect to familiar standards that are worth following for other situations. So while it sounds like I'm trying to take an easy way out by not answering the question, I think I just want to preface anything I say afterwards by, we encourage you to follow WCAG 2.1, ideally 2.2 level AA for all digital resources that are exposed to end users, including users with disabilities. So the EAA, in terms of where you act, if a product or service is available to people in specific member states, then it's likely to apply in one form or another. I would be hesitant to give cast iron guarantees that yes, US education provider who recruits in the EU either falls on one side or another. I mean, what's interesting about the European Accessibility Act is it doesn't specifically mention education as one of the areas of focus, on the assumption that the education is covered by the public sector accessibility regulations. But for a private education provider outside of the EU that may be recruiting students from the EU, I think that's a tricky one, and I don't want to give a yes or no answer. It's something that maybe we could talk about offline, or it may be something that it'd be worth seeking legal advice on. But fundamentally, making the ability to browse information about the institution, find information about courses, apply for a course, making sure that's accessible is just general. We would generally recommend that, regardless of whether the site is considered to be covered by the EAA.
So this will probably be a quick one, David. The next one is, does this include SAS? From Sherry Aldridge.
I guess we need to learn more about the definition of SAS. I mean, ultimately, if there's a user interface that users can use to access the functionality provided by the service, then I'm going to assume that yes, it would apply.
Great. And then Jerry Orvidel says, how is ebook defined? Is it defined by format, EPUB, etc., or would it be, of course, it just shifted on me, or would HTML via browser also be considered an ebook under the EAA national laws?
That's a very good question. I don't have an immediate answer to that. I will go and do some research and get back to it. Ebooks are not my area of specialty, so I'll go and do some digging and follow up on that one.
And then Nicholas Carlson asks, websites for consumer banking services contain both public and logged on pages. The directive definition of a consumer banking services specifies services covered, but that about the public pages containing information, I think it means what about the public pages pages containing information about services, but not services itself. Are they in scope?
I think again, this is just my opinion. I think if a page provides information about a service, it seems to me that it's part of the service. If it's explaining how to engage with the service, who is entitled to use the service, then it seems to me that it would be appropriate to make sure that that information is also accessible and would be considered part of the service. But again, that's just my opinion.
And then Jerry has a question, a follow-up question following this ebook question, asking how is e-reader defined? Could a browser be considered an e-reader?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ebooks and e-readers are called out specifically as separate devices, distinct from a browser providing access to something that might be considered an ebook. So whether it's a browser or a separate device like a Kindle or related, I think the specific call out for ebooks and e-readers is for dedicated hardware devices that support consumption of digital content that's considered an ebook.
Great. And Nicholas asks, the definition of e-commerce is services where a consumer has a view to conclude a consumer contract, but what services connected to the e-commerce is in scope? Are they all in scope? For example, buying an insurance is in scope as e-commerce, but what about reporting an insurance coverage by the insurance? Is that part of the web page in scope too?
Yeah, I'm going to give the same answer as before. My opinion, and I'll go and read in more detail exactly what the definition of services is, but I assume that the service covers all ways in which you as a customer who's paid for that service can engage with it. And buying insurance, yup, but making sure that you're using that product, it would seem to me that all parts of that customer journey would be covered. Again, stepping back and thinking about it as a reasonable person, would you limit accessibility requirements to purchasing something that you then couldn't use because the means to engage with that service were inaccessible? My lay opinion is that all aspects of that service, such as reporting an injury covered by an insurance policy that you purchased online, that would seem to apply to me.
So then Nicholas asks, if only a part of a website is covered by the requirement, must the whole website live up to the requirement? For example, if I sell food and I have some inspiration pages containing recipes, are the pages with the recipes also in scope?
I think that depends on defining the service that's provided by the website. Again, we would recommend that all of the website be made accessible, but at the same time, there is a sort of realistic approach that you can't necessarily devote all of your resources to all of the parts at the same time. So prioritizing efforts based on tasks that you need disabled users to be able to complete in an equivalent way to anyone else will help you figure out whether the recipes are an ancillary part to the core services provided by the website, or whether accessing a recipe would be a core service offered by the site. I think that's really a decision for the business to make, to figure out what are the services that we provide, and it will help you prioritize efforts and assess the risk of not addressing accessibility of all parts of the site.
And then Jerry asked, do you believe that the definition of ebook includes journals and journal articles, even if delivered in EPUB format? Do you have a sense of when the EU might turn its attention to journals?
I don't, but I like the question because as a former academic, access to accessible journal content as a reader and also as a publisher of journal papers is a really important part of ensuring equal access to education. So I think that yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the answer to it, but I would like to think that the definition of ebook considers journals and journal articles, but I'll need to do some more research on that one.
And then Orla Peterson asks, you mentioned a number of people with disabilities in the EU. What was the source of that?
Let me see if I can pick up the post. I think I
send that out later.
I will send that out later. Yes, I had the in fact, here we go. It's in the slide notes, so I'm just going to post a link to the answer to that question. So Orla just shared that as an answer to your question.
And then Richard Stelmach asked, what roles within a large-scale organization are useful for helping embed accessibility, improve, and govern standards?
That's a great question. And
this is our last one, David, because we're right at the end of the hour.
Yeah, lots of roles. Anybody who has authority and responsibility for a digital product, whether directly working on it, a developer, a designer, product manager, but also leadership. Leadership's essential for providing support and leading, prioritizing accessibility as a core value, ensuring that there's budget and support for product teams and everyone else involved in building and providing digital products and services. Human resources, to support accessibility as a core professional skill, to make sure that accessibility is a skill that's sought after in hiring new hires to be part of the organization. There's a whole range. Obviously, legal counsel will have a role to play in researching and ensuring that the organization understands its roles and its responsibilities across all of the different nations and states that it operates in. So it's a large and broad set of roles, and talking more about role-based accessibility is something that's really the scope for another webinar, but I'd love to talk more about that, Richard, if you're still online and like more information.
So we didn't get to all of the questions. Thank you, David, though. We got to quite a few of them. So for the last few remaining, we'll take a look at those and get an answer out to you sooner rather than later, hopefully. But again, we really appreciate everybody's attendance. I know this is an important topic to a lot of people, so I hope we were able to at least give you a better understanding. We're all trying to understand the true implications of this. So we're going to keep our eye on it, and you may see future webinars on this and other topics from us. So you please keep an eye on that.
Yep. Thanks everyone for the fantastic questions. I apologize that I wasn't able to answer all definitively, but this is an evolving space, and a lot of the conversations around specific definitions may require some more detail. So I appreciate your patience.
Yes, thanks again, Mark and David, for your time. I am posting the IDA email in the chat. If you have additional questions, feel free to reach out to the ida@tpgi.com and we will get back to you. I've also marked everyone else's questions. If we didn't get your question answered today, I'll make sure that we reach out shortly with an answer. But thanks again, everyone, for your time and have a great rest of your day.